So I actually left out a little bit from last time. I meant to go over these responses to Strawson's three arguments that we covered in the last lecture. This is part two of the Strawsonian moral responsibility. And we went over Strawson's sort of main strategy to get away from metaphysical debates that are external to our responsibility practices, which he thought were sort of fundamental, and understand responsibility in terms of, well, understanding what it means to be responsible in terms of when it's appropriate to hold someone responsible. And by that, he means elicit these reactive attitudes or direct these active attitudes towards people, and in particular towards their quality of will, whether they were doing something with ill will or not. And when that is appropriate is kind of grounded in or made appropriate by these practices of the moral community of which those people are a part, and the norms and standards in the moral responsibility practices of that community. Excuse me, I'm a little under the weather today. Sorry. So we went through that. We saw these three different arguments for why we shouldn't care about determinism. Right? Remember, he's trying to reconcile the good parts of optimism, the compatibilist picture, which is ignoring determinism. That's the good side. He thinks they're right for ignoring determinism, and get rid of the bad stuff, which is they're justifying our responsibility practices by the good social benefits that they bring about. And he doesn't want to do that. But with the pessimists, which are the libertarians, he wants to save the fact or keep the fact that's the good part, which is the fact that they want to hold on to responsibility. Right? They think there's this fundamental intuitive idea that we are in fact responsible, and some people act freely and responsibly. And he agrees, but he doesn't think that that's because determinism is false. He thinks determinism doesn't matter. He thinks that's because we should be thinking about this in terms of our actual responsibility practices and when it's appropriate to hold people responsible. And he says we shouldn't care about determinism because the rationalist argument is we have no reason to. Determinism does not actually provide any of the excusing conditions. Okay? And then the naturalist argument, which says even if we did have a reason to stop our responsibility practices, to stop blaming people, to stop having the reactive attitudes, we couldn't do that. We couldn't have an objectivist attitude stopping, not having these reactive attitudes. We couldn't do that more than temporarily. So it's psychologically impossible to do that. And then even if we had a reason to stop blaming people, to stop our responsibility practices, and even if we could do it, it wouldn't be a good idea, is the third argument, the pragmatic argument. It would be practically or pragmatically inappropriate or imprudent to stop our practices because they're essential to our humanity. Okay, and then based on that, it says, look, well, the optimist thinks that we should suspend our reactive attitudes in a certain sense too, that we should have the objective attitude because the way that they justify our practices is by responsibility. By the consequences. So we don't have to really see people with our reactive attitudes. We don't really have to see them as moral agents in a sort of robust kind of way. We just have to think about, no blame, punishment, anything. We just have to think about how our policies and practices affect people's behavior for the good or the bad. Right? And he says, well, that requires taking this, exploitative view of our nature, thinking of people as objects to be trained and modified. And that requires a kind of objective stance, which he thinks that we can't have and we shouldn't have. So it works against optimism in a certain way too. Okay, now let's look at what Russell says about the problems with these three arguments, and then we'll move into the other sort of modified versions of Strawson's view. All right, so problems with the rationalist argument. Well, pessimism and skepticism don't actually seem to imply that those conditions would need to hold. So remember that the rationalist argument said, well, pessimism and skepticism, libertarian and skeptic views, they assume that determinism would imply this global excuse, and they assume that it would imply it in this way. These are the only two kinds of excuses. That's what Strawson said. And Russell here is saying, well, look, Strawson seems to be wrong. That pessimism and skepticism don't imply that everyone would be either morally or psychologically abnormal. Those are the kinds of excuses that Strawson allows. Like, all it says is that whatever the capacity that's required for responsibility level control, whatever capacity you need to have and exercise in order to be held responsible, that capacity is undermined by determinism. Strawson says, well, that means people would have to be either morally abnormal, that like morally immature, like a child, or psychologically abnormal, like a psychopath or have a mental disorder. Those are the only kinds of excuses, exemptions really. And Russell's saying, it's not clear why that's true. Why can't you have some other capacity? Like maybe a relevant capacity is the ability to choose between two options. And determinism seems to rule that out. So the point is just, it doesn't seem like Strawson allows enough here. He's being too restrictive, and he doesn't really defend why he's being so restrictive, right? The idea that determinism can't incapacitate everyone, he doesn't really defend that. He just says determinism doesn't imply this, that everyone's sort of psychologically abnormal or morally incompetent. Yeah, but that doesn't show that it can't incapacitate everyone. It doesn't show that determinism is not a problem. It just shows that determinism can't create this problem, right? But he doesn't defend the fact that that's the only way to be incapacitated, right? There's other ways, like losing the ability to do otherwise, which you can lose without having this stuff. So he just doesn't do enough to defend the fact. He says determinism has to be a global excuse if pessimism is true. But determinism is not a global excuse. See, because here's the two options. And the objection is saying, well, these aren't the only two options. That's the objection. Okay. Now, the naturalist argument said we can't stop our reactive attitudes, right? We can't stop. Even if we had a reason to, we can't stop. So it's sort of useless, right? Well, Strawson's confusing what the pessimist is trying to do. He's confused about what they're trying to do. So he says reactive attitudes are kind of natural, right? So we can't use these metaphysical ideas, this idea of determinism being true, what the laws of nature are like. Those are external, right? And we can't justify what's sort of natural in terms of something that's really external to that, these kind of esoteric intellectual ideas. We need to look to the natural practice itself, right? But they're not trying to justify, right? They're not trying to justify this general disposition towards the reactive attitudes, the pessimist. Right? They're not trying to justify the fact that we have this tendency to have the reactive attitudes. They're trying to see if some particular instance of expressing a reactive attitude. So it's not like the libertarians trying to justify like the fact that we naturally have this disposition to blame each other. They're wondering if individual instances of when somebody blames someone else, whether those are justified, right? And Strawson's saying like, well, you can't justify this tendency to blame people because that's a natural tendency we have. Like, well, yeah, I'm not trying to justify the natural tendency. I'm trying to see if individual instances of when we blame people are justified. And that's very different. And that does seem like it might require thinking about whether someone had the ability to do otherwise, whether it was fair in certain ways, whether determinism was true, whether this person's just a mechanistic kind of robot or not. Right? These questions seem important. And it's not about trying to justify whether we have this natural tendency. It's about the appropriateness of particular expressions of the reactive attitudes. That's what we're trying to justify. And the naturalist argument doesn't really affect that. So we can obviously suspend particular expressions. Strawson admits that himself. He says that there are exemptions, excuses, right? When somebody's brainwashed, when someone's a child, we can stop our reactive attitudes once we learn that. And that's about particular expressions. And that's what the libertarian is interested in, the pessimist and the skeptic, right? So it's kind of a category error here by Strawson. So he also misses the point kind of completely, but in a different way. So our reactive attitudes could just be wrong. So the pessimist and the skeptic say, hey, determinism might be a really big problem for free will. If determinism is true, maybe nobody's responsible. And Strawson's like, yeah, but even if that's true, we can't just stop our reactive attitudes. It's too instinctive for us. And the objection to that argument might just be, so what if we can't stop it? Why not think we're just wrong? Every time that we have a blaming attitude towards someone, we're just wrong. We're wrong. It's kind of like, and we're wrong in an important sense, right? So it might be like thinking about, I don't know, material objects like a table. There's a table here. And, if you think about the table being, you look at it and you have this intuition that it's dense, not full of space. And you feel it, and it's really hard. And there may be a sense in which those things are right, that it's hard and it's, takes up space and is not made up of empty space, not full of space. But when you really look more closely and you get some evidence, you might see that, well, hardness is just kind of a way we experience something that may not be hard in another sense. And the same with being solid, right? It's not kind of really solid, at least not in the way that it first appears. And or maybe a better example is thinking of putting a straw into a glass full of water, halfway full of water. It looks like the straw kind of separates and is not. Sometimes people say that the bent straw, what's it called, illusion, but it just kind of looks like the straw's broken in half, right, and separated. It's not touching at the point where it enters the water. But obviously that's not true, right? It looks that way. We can't help that it looks this way. The Mueller-Lyer illusion, where the two lines look like they're different lengths because of the way that the arrows on the end point. Arrows pointing out makes it look longer. Arrows pointing in makes it look shorter, but it's the same size. These kinds of illusions, right? The point is just because something seems something in some way, and maybe it's even really kind of innate, natural, that we're going to perceive something in some way. That doesn't mean that it matches up with how the world is. We are fallible, right? And so the point here is just, even if it was psychologically impossible for us to stop the reactive attitudes, that doesn't mean that they're right. That doesn't mean that they're appropriate, right? So we're interested in whether they're justified in a certain sense. But why couldn't they just be necessary and unjustified, right? He says they might be necessary, like we can't stop them. Like, well, that's not the question of whether they're justified. That's the question of whether we have a choice in doing it or not. All right. So problems with the pragmatic argument, which again was the idea that even if we had a reason to stop our reactive attitudes, and even if we could, we shouldn't, because it's required for our sort of humanity. Well, he presupposes the consequentialist considerations that he rejects for the optimist view. So he says the optimist view is bad because it justifies our moral responsibility practices by the good consequences that it produces. Right? And so he said, like, when he's doing this pragmatic argument, he says, well, okay, suppose we had a reason to stop. Suppose determinism was a reason to stop our reactive attitudes. And suppose we could stop them. Well, now imagine that God gives you a button and says, if you push this button, everyone will stop blaming each other. There will be no more moral responsibility practices. He's like, should we do it? And he says, no, think about that. We wouldn't do it, right? We shouldn't do that because they're necessary for our humanity, for moral life, right? So it's a couple kind of questions here. Like, one, he criticized the optimist for falling back on consequentialist considerations, right? He criticized them for that, and it seems like that's what he's doing here. But also think, why wouldn't, when we're considering whether to push this button, why wouldn't other things matter besides the excuses he talked about, right? Why wouldn't considerations of whether people are excused because of determinism, do they have the ability to do otherwise? Do they need the ability to do otherwise? These kinds of questions, why wouldn't we consider those before we push this button or not, right? And if we are considering those, then the consequentialist considerations about our practices being good for humanity aren't the only thing that we should consider. But it doesn't matter. Even if they were, he criticized the consequentialist position earlier. So he's got like an internal inconsistency here. And also, it's not even really clear that pessimism says that we should suspend our practices. So he's like, even if we had a reason, even if we could, we shouldn't do that. Therefore, pessimism is false. Remember, he says, if pessimism is true, here it is. If pessimism is true, then we should suspend our reactive attitudes and moral responsibility practices. It's like, well, why think that pessimism presupposes that? Look at Smolansky. He's a skeptic. Smolansky's a skeptic, and he does not think that we should stop blaming each other and holding each other accountable. He doesn't think that. That's why he has the view called illusionism. He thinks that we should maintain the illusion. He agrees with this, right? Or parts of this. He agrees that reactive attitudes and the moral responsibility practices are important for our humanity. Smolansky agrees. But he's a skeptic. What does he think? I mean, basically this. Or this, I should say. Like, Smolansky thinks these are good things. They're helpful for society to have these blaming practices. They kind of keep people in order. They give us a foundation for moral life. But they're wrong. They're just wrong. They're wrong in a certain sense, insofar as they presuppose that the person is sort of genuinely morally responsible and genuinely acted freely. They're wrong in that sense, if they presuppose that stuff. If they don't, great. But the point is just that we can still use these attitudes in a like socially beneficial way, even though the sort of freedom and responsibility that we often think they seem to be getting at are not really there. That's Smolansky's view. And so he can be a skeptic without saying that we should suspend our responsibility practices. And the same thing with Pereboom in a certain sense. So we talked about Pereboom's sort of response to skepticism. So he's a skeptic as well. He thinks no one's free and responsible in a sort of ultimate or genuine sense, in the basic desert sense that we talked about. But he doesn't think that we should just stop blaming people and just give up our responsibility practices. He thinks we should stop blaming people in a certain way, not retributivist, and not in a retributivist sense. People don't deserve blame, so we shouldn't blame them if that's what we're doing. But we can still have a kind of modified responsibility practice towards people, right? And he bases this roughly in rights and self-defense, defense of others, so that we can incapacitate people, as he calls it, insofar as there's a justifiable belief that they're going to be a threat to other people, or maybe themselves or others. So he thinks we can have, and other people, Greg Caruso and some other people, that we can have these replacement systems. So even if skepticism is true, we would still have a kind of responsibility practice. So it's just false that pessimism and skepticism imply that we should suspend our practices. That's just false. Smolansky and Pereboom are examples of skeptics that don't think that, and they're not being incoherent. So the general problem is that there's no account of, there's a few problems, and I think this is Russell saying, here's the general problem. I think we should focus on these other problems too. There's other problems that are just as important. But the problem that Russell, that wrote the chapter, wants to focus on is that Strawson does not give an account of what it would mean to say that someone is responsible in the sense that they have the relevant capacities. He just doesn't do that. He thinks that's not important. What seems like he thinks it's not important because he doesn't really talk about it. He doesn't say, hey, here's the capacity that someone needs in order for us to hold them responsible. Even internal to our practices, right? He says we should be internal to our practices. It's not about determinism, but he doesn't give us an alternative. He says, when children do things, we don't hold them responsible. When someone who's mentally ill does something, these are like excusing conditions, but he doesn't say what those excusing conditions are getting at. He doesn't say why those excusing conditions are appropriate. He doesn't say what the relevant capacities are that are missing that make those excusing conditions appropriate, right? So we can't even know, right? This is kind of another objection to him, or maybe put another way, we can't even know if determinism undermines responsibility on Strawson's view, because he doesn't say what the capacities are that we need for responsibility. He doesn't say why those excusing conditions can hold. So he says, here's the two categories of excuse. Determinism doesn't imply either. Well, it's like, how can we know that if we don't know what those excuse categories are getting at, right? Why do those excuses apply? He doesn't say that. So he just assumes we know what the capacities are, that we'll be able to kind of know it when we see it. And that's just a really weak foundation. So that's the general problem. Now, we're going to get into, R.J. Wallace, who wanted to try to fix Strawsonian responsibility, and mainly by focusing on this part. So Russell says, here's the problem, or a central problem, is that Strawson didn't tell us what the relevant capacities are. He didn't say what it takes to be responsible. He tried to argue that we shouldn't care about determinism. We shouldn't think that determinism is important to what it takes to be responsible. We should ignore determinism. But he didn't tell us what it takes. So he's supposed to be a compatibilist, and if you remember the compatibilist burden, they are trying to tell us, or they need to tell us, I should say, what kinds of things are sufficient, what it takes. They need to tell us what's enough for responsibility. And Strawson doesn't do that. And that's a burden he's supposed to have, but he doesn't do that. So Wallace wants to try to fix that. And he talks about the moral sentiments, which are very kind of same idea of reactive attitudes for our purposes. He wants to get rid of some of them, so we'll see. So he has a kind of normative strategy. Normative meaning that it's based in kind of value or an ethical framework. Okay, so he says we have to begin by focusing on what's involved with holding people responsible, and that's the kind of Strawsonian approach, right? We shouldn't think of the abstract agent in isolation and think about what it takes for them to be responsible. We should think, if we're thinking about responsibility, we should think about our own practices. What does it take? Let's look to the human practice of holding people responsible and ask ourselves, what does it take for someone to be responsible? When is it appropriate to hold people responsible? That's the Strawsonian approach. But then he says this involves fairness. It's thinking about when is it fair to hold someone responsible? When is it reasonable to hold someone responsible? Okay, and these are normative concepts. They're not metaphysical concepts. At least they're normative. They're not purely metaphysical. They have considerations of value, fairness, reasonable, right? There's norms here. Evaluative norms. What is the standard for fairness? What is the standard for something being a reasonable? What does it take to say that it's reasonable for someone to blame someone else, or it's fair for someone? We don't have to answer that question. The point is just to say, when you think about that question, when is it fair? When is it reasonable to hold someone responsible? These are evaluative, normative claims. Okay. Now, this is also an order reversal, since when he does the same thing as Strawson, he's saying the question of when someone is responsible, or what it means for someone to be responsible, is understood in terms of holding people responsible, when it's appropriate to hold them responsible. So to be responsible is to be appropriately held responsible. And that concerns questions about fairness and reasonableness. And that is a kind of order reversal as well. All right. So there's two components to Wallace's account. One is about when it's appropriate to hold someone responsible. And there, he just does a kind of Strawson picture, right? But he changes, this taxonomy is like the categorization. He has a sentiment-based view of the reactive attitudes. And this just does a little bit of different moral psychology than Strawson. Not super important for our purposes, okay, but he does focus on negative emotions more. It's, as what Russell says, Russell calls the distinctive syndrome. I don't know if Russell is quoting Wallace here, so either Russell or Wallace. They use this idea of the distinctive syndrome is the negative emotions, resentment, anger, these blaming attitudes. All right. Again, this is their order reversal. So to be responsible is understood in terms of holding responsible, and then to hold responsible is to have certain moral expectations towards someone. So if you hold someone responsible, this presupposes that you had some normative expectation that they ought to do something or that they ought not to have done something. Right? So that's the normative component, that holding someone responsible entails that you had some expectation they were supposed to uphold and that they didn't. Right? And they're rationalized because they're justified by moral reasons. Okay. Those expectations that we presuppose when we hold someone responsible are rationalized in the sense that we hold those expectations for moral reasons. But also, those just sort of are the obligations that people have. This is Wallace's interpretation of Russell, right? And so holding those expectations to people, right? What it means to hold those expectations to people is just for you to be disposed to have certain sentiments or reactive attitudes towards them, to have an emotional response towards them. So when you're disposed, when you have the tendency to have these blaming attitudes towards someone, that's what it is to hold those expectations. They're not identical, but they're kind of they're one and one. They sort of go together. I shouldn't say that because that's kind of identity. They're not identical. It's just like, think of like the kind of common example is a statue and the clay that the statue's made out of. So you can smash the statue or the clay, you can smash the clay back down. You can mold a statue out of clay, and then you can like crumble the clay back down into a ball. And the clay is there the whole time, right? The same clay is always there. But the statue goes away. You can make another statue. You can make 3 statues in a row. You can make one, take a picture, smash the clay back down, make another one, take a picture. You made 3 statues there that are not identical, but the clay is identical. And what that means is that this, there's debates about this, but the basic idea, though, that we're going to assume is that the statue is not identical to the clay, because the clay persists throughout the process. It's the same clay through all 3 pictures, or through the process of you making statues and taking pictures. But different statues come into and go out of existence. And if the statue has different identity conditions or persistence conditions as the clay, then the clay and the statue can't be identical to each other. And so this is instead of identity, constitution is this relation that people sometimes talk about. So I know that's really it might be a little bit more than we need, but the point is just to say that we need this kind of relation to talk about this in terms of Wallace's picture, because I'll just go to it here. When you hold someone responsible on Wallace's view, you have this blame. This is all kind of just Strawson stuff here. You have this blaming attitude. It's directed at somebody for performing some action, right? But Wallace called these the sentiments. He had kind of a different idea, but we don't have to really talk about that. You have this kind of moral sentiment that might be like a kind of blaming attitude. But his claim is just that when you have this blaming attitude, the orange, that sort of presupposes that you have this expectation that this person should not have done this thing. That's the expectation, right? So holding responsible means holding someone to certain moral expectations. And when you hold someone responsible, when you hold those expectations, that is constituted by, it's sort of made up of, something like that, but not identical to, being disposed to this attitude. So having this expectation about people performing this kind of action means that you're disposed to blame them if they do perform that action, right? Having this expectation, that's why this line is purple. Part of having this expectation is constituted by being disposed towards these attitudes, right? And this expectation is also justified by moral reasons. So this person here doesn't hold this expectation without thinking about the reasons. They're kind of cognitive, they're sort of rationalized in that way. And then when this person holds this expectation, that also means that they're just going to be disposed to have these blaming attitudes when somebody performs the action that violates this expectation. That's kind of the picture. These all kind of come together for Wallace. And then he says, having this expectation and the fact that it's being justified by these reasons, this right here, having this expectation for these moral reasons, is just what a moral obligation is. Moral obligations about, let's say, doing A, are constituted by people holding, the moral community really, holding these expectations for moral reasons. That's sort of what the obligations are in a certain sense. They're not identical, but they're constituted by these things. And so it makes the reactive attitudes more cognitive because it ties them to this like rationalized picture that's based in reasons and these judgments, expectations. People should not have done A, right? People should not do A. And then you have this related judgment that this person here should not have done A, right? It links your moral, and then you get this attitude because of this expectation. This expectation just makes you disposed to have these attitudes when people break it, right? And so it makes the reactive attitudes more cognitive rather than just these pure raw emotions that we have, emotional responses. So Wallace tries to kind of beef up the Strawson picture. Okay. Now, a couple worries that Russell talks about with Wallace. So it focuses exclusively on the negative, as we set up here. Focuses on the negative. Now, so that's not necessarily bad, other than sometimes people worry that we place too much emphasis on blame. And maybe if we look at praise and see that, or positive reactive attitudes, and see that they work differently, that's a problem. It's either means you're going to have to defend some kind of asymmetry thesis where the positive and negative reactive attitudes work differently, and then maybe even worse, that blameworthiness and praiseworthiness themselves work differently. And that's not incoherent. It's just an extra burden that you have to bear to defend that thesis. It's much simpler to have an account of responsibility where it works the same on both blame and praise. If they work differently, then you just have more work to do, which is fine. It's just another burden. So focusing exclusively on the negative reactive attitudes, on negative responsibility, just means you risk having extra burdens. Also, it's just odd that that natural moral responsibility would only cover blaming, because if it's supposed to be naturalized, if it's supposed to be based on our practices, I mean, obviously we do more than blame people, right? We hold people responsible in the positive sense. We praise them, we reward them, we are grateful towards them, and so on. And to just miss all that on a view that's supposed to be like really naturalist is a little odd. So that's just something to think about. Holding people morally responsible actually doesn't seem to involve the emotions, at least not necessarily. Sorry, it does involve the emotions, obviously, a lot of times, but not necessarily. That's the objection here, is that Wallace kind of puts these judgments, holding people responsible involves these judgments that they violated some obligation, some expectation that's grounded in reasons, and so some obligation. Like making this more rationalized judgment that they've done something wrong and that therefore they're sort of responsible, and that's kind of what disposes you to the attitudes. But when you add all this rationalized stuff in here, it seems like you can get all this without the reactive attitudes, right? So you can hold people responsible, judge them to be morally blameworthy, say, but not have any emotional reaction for whatever reason, right? So Wallace seems to have a couple of responses. He can either say, well, look, all you really need is you don't need the emotional response, the reactive attitude, to actually come up. You don't actually need it to be expressed. You just need a disposition towards it, right? The susceptibility to feel the emotions is all you need. And if you don't even like that, you say like, well, you can blame someone without even being disposed, right? To blame them or to feel the emotional reactive attitudes towards them. He'll say, okay, well then all you need is just this belief that it's appropriate for someone to feel that way towards them. But you might think maybe you don't even need that, and that's something you can think about. So that's the idea with holding people responsible, right? So Wallace tried to give he gives an account of holding people responsible because he is a Strawsonian, right? This is his Strawsonian side. To be responsible is to appropriately hold someone responsible, or to be appropriately held responsible. And he says what that means. And it's very Strawsonian. He just adds this cognitive bit to kind of beef it up. But then he tries to do a little bit more by adding in this capacity side. Because remember, Strawson didn't tell us what it takes to be responsible, what it takes to be a moral agent who can be held responsible. So Wallace tries to do that, and he bases it in reflective self-control. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because I'm realizing now we've talked about this with reasons responsiveness. It's very, very similar. Okay. He gives an account of what the capacity is that's required for someone to have and express in order to hold them responsible. And it's reflective self-control, a kind of reasons responsiveness, really. And this is going to give us some exempting conditions, which is what was missing from Strawson's view. Strawson tells us two types of excuse, but not the conditions for when they apply. Okay, and that's what Wallace is going to do. So he rejects the libertarian-based control, like this agent causal powers and stuff. He doesn't like that, right? We don't need this like power to choose between two alternatives. It's too demanding. That's typically the complaint from compatibilists. This is too demanding of an account of control. And you might worry that this risks running a slippery slope into begging the question. But he also thinks that this gets us away, like Strawson, he thinks this gets away from what's important, our natural reactive attitudes, our natural moral responsibility practices, right? And so he has a practice-based approach, obviously, to moral agency. So when we're thinking about moral agency, we also want to think about, well, how do we understand this concept in our ordinary practices, right? And this is, I think, anyways, the kind of underlying intuition of even people like John Fisher, who will say things, he gives this really fascinating account of moral agency based in reason, responsiveness, and this sort of counterfactual analysis. Counterfactual kind of contemplation of your capacity to respond to reasons, right? We should think about what you would do were you in other circumstances that were relevantly similar, faced with reasons to not do what you did. This kind of thing, I think he gives this account, which is really great, and then he gets all these objections from people, and I think the sort of underlying sentiment when he's responding to these objections is, well, look, like, what's important? What do we think is important when we think about how we blame and praise people and how we think about moral responsibility? What is important? It's whether people can respond to reasons. We want people to be able to understand, grasp moral reasons, and then apply those. And that's why we react to people. That's why we blame people. There is this kind of important training or learning sense to our responsibility practices. And if we thought that someone couldn't understand moral reasons, if we thought that they couldn't really understand the fact that, the reason we respond to them in certain ways is because they did something wrong. If they can't understand that, and if we give them moral reasons to change their behavior, whether that's trying to explain certain things to them, or maybe actively punishing them, or whatever it is, or even just social punishment, like dirty looks and grumbles when someone cuts in front of you in line, or the famous kind of half look behind you in the movie theater when someone's talking. These are kind of blaming practices, right? And when we're trying to modify people's behavior, the point of this is just, I think Fisher would think that Wallace and Strawson are onto something when they say, look, what's really important here is that we want people to be able to grasp and apply moral reasons, right? It's just really intuitive. And what Wallace is going to want to do is just to say, look, this is natural, this is practice-based, right? This reflective self-control theory is really what we care about. That's the capacity that we should care about when we're thinking of what it takes for someone to be a moral agent. We want them to be rational. We want them to be rational, but in a normative sense. We want them to be able to grasp and understand moral reasons, and to be practically rational, to put those moral reasons into action, right? So control then is about normative competence, moral competence. Can we grasp and apply moral reasons? And can we have do we have the power to regulate our behavior in response to those reasons, right? Grasp them and apply them and have the power to regulate our behavior. Should sound familiar, right? So again, we've seen this picture before. When we're thinking about whether someone did an action A or didn't do an action, they did not A, whether they did that freely and responsibly and competently, and whether they had exercised an ability here or a capacity that makes them an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes, whether that's blame or praise, right? In order to understand that capacity, well, what is that capacity that they need? This picture is the reasons responsiveness picture, the one that Wallace likes, it's about normative competence. Can we grasp the moral reasons Did the person have the ability to grasp the moral reasons related to doing A? Did they recognize them? And if they did, do they have this other sort of related capacity to take those reasons, consider them, consider their own desires and so on, and then apply those reasons in action? Do the right thing for the right reasons, or not do the wrong thing for the right reasons, or refrain for the right reasons from doing the wrong thing. That's what I mean. And on all these views, on Strawson, Wallace, Fisher, they are supposed to be okay with all of this happening deterministically. Okay? So reflective self-control, can we grasp and apply moral reasons? Right? And so when the person has this capacity, when they have enough ability to grasp and apply moral reasons, is a matter of fairness and reasonableness. Right? We ask, when is it fair to adopt the stance of holding them responsible? Well, when they have this capacity, right? Yeah, but how much capacity? When do we know? We can have these intuitions about fairness. So the agent's moral and practical reasoning, right, it's the same as before. It's either it can be temporarily disrupted by being drunk, let's say. But then we might ask whether it was their fault that they got drunk. But let's say somebody just intoxicated them unwillingly. Well, now they have an impaired ability to grasp and respond to moral reasons, but we're excusing them temporarily because they got intoxicated by no fault of their own. Or they might be a child or someone who's mentally disabled, and they just don't have this capacity, either yet or anymore or never will. But the same kinds of excusing conditions can apply, right? And how do we know if their capacity has been disrupted or it's missing? What's the difference, say, between an addict and a non-addict? Intuitions about fairness and reasonableness, and maybe some neuroscience and psychology, but we'll see. We might find out that that's not going to be sufficient. We need to do some philosophy as well. But determinism does not make it unfair. Determinism doesn't make this capacity go away. You can still have people who grasp and apply moral reasons, even if determinism is true. So think about it this way. If determinism is true, there'd still be a difference between people who act for reasons and people who don't. That's supposed to be the idea anyways. Okay. Now, let's see some more reason with Wallace. Well, he confuses, Russell says, this is the way I'm saying it. He confuses having a capacity and exercising that capacity. So, again, this is kind of an objection to these counterfactual reasons, responsive views anyways, but why should it matter that this person has some general capacity for applying moral reasons, right? Yeah, they have some general capacity. If we look at them over time through their life, we see that they're generally able to understand moral reasons, and generally they're able to apply those in their actions, fairly well, reasonably, most of the time, whatever. Why does that matter to what they did now in the actual scenario? If there's nothing that they could have done, to avoid doing A here, nothing they could have done, and there's nothing they could have done to change what their capacity is right now when they act, why does it matter that they have the general capacity in other situations to grasp and apply moral reasons? We're interested in what they do now, right? They might have no control over having the powers they do now, why the powers are the way they are now, how they exercise their powers now. It could all be determined. Right? So why is having a general capacity what's relevant? What's relevant should be how that capacity is exercised in the moment. Okay. And then the reasonableness and fairness standards seem to beg the question, because in order to tell the difference between two really close-looking cases, we're supposed to just use our intuitions about what's reasonable or fair. But it seems like that risks pulling in intuitions about when people are responsible. And we're supposed to be figuring out when people are responsible, not presupposing it. Okay. So that's the worries with Wallace. Well, we'll move on. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through this. Sorry. Okay, not too much left. All right. So Angela Smith criticizes Strawson, and she basically criticizes this order reversal. So she does not like the fact that they start or they understand being responsible in terms of holding responsible. She thinks being responsible is more fundamental. And the Strawsonians try to make holding responsible more fundamental. So, look, so Strawson says, understanding what it means to be responsible should be done in terms of what it means to appropriately hold someone responsible. And that's why he goes to our practices. Instead of saying, are our practices of holding responsible right? In order to figure out when we appropriately hold someone responsible, we need to figure out what it means to be responsible. He doesn't like that. He reverses it, but Angela Smith thinks he's wrong. So she says there's two concepts, right? Being at fault, being responsible, and being an appropriate target, being appropriately held responsible. She says, look, they're not the same. They come apart. Appropriately holding someone responsible, so actively blaming someone, if that's appropriate, it implies that the person is responsible. So it's only appropriate to blame someone when they're actually responsible. So if it's appropriate to blame someone, this implies that they are responsible. But that's not true in the other direction. If someone actually is at fault, if they actually are responsible, that does not yet imply that it's appropriate to hold them responsible, to actually blame them. We might not have any standing. We might not have any standing to blame, right? Maybe they're really remorseful or whatever. So here's some examples. We might not have any standing to blame. There might be no grounds for actually blaming someone. So it might be inappropriate if say, you are guilty of the same crime, right? It might be true that a kind of hypocrite principle is true, that you don't have the appropriate grounds to blame someone, to actively blame someone if you've committed the same crime, let's say, or the same wrongdoing. Let's just pretend that's true. That would not make that other person excused, right? It can be true that you don't have any standing to blame someone even though that person is responsible. And that means being at fault and being appropriately held at fault, responsible, those come apart. Same thing for insignificance. So the wrong that you do, the harm that you cause might be just really, really minimal, right? Might be none of your business. Someone might have lied to their spouse, right? Like, you don't have any grounds, right? And maybe the wrong there is just not, it might be a trivial wrong, right? Like a trivial lie. Not a big deal. Maybe the spouse can get angry and blame them. It might even be too insignificant for that, but suppose that's true. But you, the neighbor, let's say, it's just not a big enough wrong for you to step in and blame, right? It's none of your business, almost. But that doesn't mean the person's not responsible. They might still be responsible. So the same thing with remorse. The person might have shown enough guilt and remorse to where it's just inappropriate to blame them now. But that doesn't make them not responsible. So the point here is that these two things come apart. And if they come apart, if someone can be responsible, even though it's not appropriate to hold them responsible, then we should not understand what it means to be responsible in terms of being appropriately held responsible. And that's what Strawson tried to do. And that's why Smith, by showing this distinction between these two concepts, is supposed to show us that reversing this order is inappropriate, right? We cannot analyze being responsible in terms of being held responsible because they have different satisfaction conditions. So we think about this. Think of a person who's performed an action, and then there's these people who might hold them responsible with these reactive attitudes. And the red is supposed to indicate these times where it's just not appropriate for this person or this person to hold them responsible, even though they are responsible, right? They might know things. This person might know things like the fact that this person was really, really remorseful and sorry, and they've paid their dues, right? Maybe this person might have an exempting condition, and they know it. But let's just focus on the fact that whether or not it's appropriate for these people, factors that determine the appropriateness of this, right? This person might have legitimate standing to blame. Maybe nobody does, right? But there's this example where some people do, some people don't. But the factors that determine whether it's appropriate for these people on the outside to hold them responsible might be different from the factors that determine whether this person is in fact responsible. That's what Smith is saying. Someone might be responsible even though someone doesn't have the grounds to hold them responsible. Someone might be responsible even though the significance of the harm here is so low that some people don't have the appropriateness to blame them. And they may have shown so much guilt and remorse that it makes it inappropriate to keep blaming them. And the point, again, is that the factors that make this person responsible can come apart or be different from the factors that make it appropriate to hold them responsible. And that's Smith's main objection. So Russell says, well, Smith has this objection here. It's pretty nice, but Wallace, or someone defending him, like Russell, defending the kind of Strawsonian approach, might say, well, appropriately holding someone responsible only requires that you have this belief, right? So all you really need, you don't actually have to, the inappropriateness that Smith is talking about. So like, someone might be responsible even though it's inappropriate to hold them responsible. What Wallace might say is that, well, the inappropriateness might just be actually expressing the blaming attitude. But you don't need that. All you need is just belief that it's apt. So this person might have to hold back their response, but they could still believe, that this person's appropriate in blaming them because it's really about this person being harmed, or just believing that, maybe God might be able to blame them. So you don't need to actually express these on Wallace's account anyways. But also, Russell says, imagine a world where everybody is fully responsible, right? Like Spock world, where Spock has the ability to, right, understand and apply moral reasons. So they're a moral agent capable of being responsible, but where it's never really appropriate to blame them. Nobody really has the standing, right? Because they don't have any reactive attitudes. Spock doesn't have any sort of emotional, moral attitudes. Purely rational, right? But purely rational, I mean, they can understand moral reasons, let's say. You might think there's a worry with the setup here, but set that aside. Just imagine a scenario. It seems like basically the response is Smith's objection seems to imply that you can have a world where everyone is a fully morally responsible agent, but where it's never appropriate to blame anyone, because let's say they don't have any reactive attitudes. Wallace says, or Russell says, are they really responsible if nobody has the capacity to hold them responsible? Well, you might wonder if this just begs the question against this distinction. Because Smith is saying Strawson's view is wrong. Strawson's view is wrong-headed. Wallace's view is wrong-headed. And the reason is because they try to understand being responsible in terms of appropriately holding responsible. So someone's responsible whenever it's appropriate to hold them, according to the practices. And Angela Smith says, this is the wrong way to think about it, because these two factors, the conditions for when someone's responsible, are not so tightly linked up to the conditions for when it's appropriate to hold someone responsible. There might be someone who's responsible and it's never appropriate to hold them responsible, right? And so that's the objection. You can't analyze this in terms of this because they come apart. So Strawson is wrong, says Smith. Now Wallace and Russell, sort of Russell really, comes back and says, well, Smith's objection has a problem because it seems to imply that you might have a whole entire world where people are responsible, but it's never appropriate to hold them responsible. And Russell says, that seems like a problem, because would they really be responsible if no one could ever hold them responsible? And I think Smith should say, yeah, like that's just exactly what I just said. It's possible for someone to be responsible even though no one can hold them responsible. Like, so Wallace and Russell are basically just going to say, well, that seems like a problem. It seems like a person can't be responsible if literally no one could hold them responsible. But I don't see how Smith needs to accept that. She can just say, you're just assuming that my distinction is wrong. Your thought experiment about this world of people, it's only problematic if you think that my distinction fails. If you think my distinction is fine, then yeah, it's possible for there to be a world where everyone is responsible. Everyone has the capacity to be morally responsible and is in fact morally responsible, but where no one can blame anyone. No one can actively blame anyone. Smith is going to say, I just don't see why that is incoherent. I don't see why that's a problem. So that's, I think, should be her response. Now, we'll just consider this relevance of history stuff at the very end, and then we'll be done. The relevance of history. Okay. Now, the reason this matters is because this question matters is because Strawson is trying to say that a certain kind of history doesn't matter. At least these questions come up, right? He says determinism doesn't matter. There's this idea in Wallace's view where it doesn't matter if the mechanism you had is determined, right? It's just about whether you have this capacity. And then remember from last week, the mesh theories of responsibility, they don't care about history. They just care that your action was caused by the right kind of psychological makeup. So there's this question of history that we've been kind of implicitly assuming is relevant, we've been implicitly discussing. And there's a question of whether history is relevant. That's what I want to say. Now, think about the case of this guy named Robert Alton Harris, who, I think there's other Robert Harrises. Robert Alton Harris was a guy who killed some people. So in, I think, the 70s or something like that, this guy Robert Harris, who he was in jail for manslaughter, okay? I think he beat some guy to death. So I think they did it as like a kind of, what's it called? Like a rage kind of thing. I can't remember what the terminology is, but where he just kind of snapped in the moment, crime of passion. There you go. And so he got manslaughter instead of 25 to life first degree murder thing. So he got this manslaughter conviction. He served some time, and then he got a parole. And he was on parole, and him and his brother went and came across these two young boys, 16-year-old boys, who were eating some McDonald's in their car in a parking lot somewhere. And they came upon them. They held them at gunpoint, basically kidnapped them. I think Harris got into the car with the boys, and then his brother followed them, and he held them at gunpoint and forced them to drive up into this, kind of small canyon-y area like you might see in LA or something, like into the canyon, hiking trail or something. But they went off a little distance and kind of a remote area, and they kind of tortured them, really, psychologically kind of torturing them a little bit, but then promised he wouldn't kill them, and then he did and murdered them. And I want to say that I've seen a story where he killed one of the boys and the other one was kind of running away, and he let him run away for a little bit, and then he killed him. But just kind of brutal, right? Just remorseless, brutal. And then they took their car, the boys' car, and they took it back to Harris's house, and they ate their food. They took their fast food back there, and they ate the rest of their food, and Harris was reportedly just joking about it, and it was just pretty brutal and cold. And then they took their car and they robbed a bank with it, and then they got caught. Okay, and you reportedly boasted about the killings and all that. Our intuitive reaction is that this is disgusting. It's anger, right? Indignation. We resent them for this. We're disgusted at them for this, especially Harris. But then we find out through the trial and so on, it's revealed that Robert Harris, had this just disgustingly awful upbringing. He was just brutal. I mean, from the get-go, he had two alcoholic parents who were physically and emotionally just abusive. Would throw, I don't know if it was his biological father or his stepfather, but they would throw, he would throw full beer cans at him. This is reported by his sister later. Throw beer cans at him when he was a kid, right? Like a little kid at the table, and made him eat on the ground with the dog, and just grossly abusive, right? He was born premature already. Maybe had fetal alcohol syndrome. Him and his siblings were molested by his dad. And he went into juvenile hall at about 13. He was raped repeatedly. Just really kind of terrible, terrible upbringing as a child. And then, of course, at that age, then he starts being kind of a troublemaker, right? And he's in and out of juvenile hall and gets worse and worse. And eventually this kind of leads to him beating that guy to death. Kind of this rage thing, right? So he's let out. So you just kind of find out that he has this really terrible upbringing. This is like, you almost might think, gosh, like what other path was this guy going to go down, you know? And so if even if it doesn't fully excuse Harris for you, emotionally anyways, it at least seems to mitigate it, right? Our reaction kind of mellows a little, right? It comes down a little from this initial reaction. We might have a little bit of sympathy, a little regret for gosh, it's just regretful that he went through this and it led to what he did. You know, we might feel sorrowful for him, even just a little bit. It might mitigate the blame. And the point here is that seems like history is starting to matter. The history of how you became the way you were seems to intuitively matter to us, right? And that seems like a problem because compatibilist conditions, the stuff that compatibilists say is enough for freedom, seems like those can be engineered into us by manipulation. Now think back to Mealy, the Ann and Beth thing from the reading, the Ann and Beth case, Pereboom's 4-case manipulation argument, Todd's a couple manipulation arguments that we've seen. Whatever compatibilists say is enough or sufficient for responsibility. Seems like we can get those into a case where someone manipulates those in, and then it seems like the fact that they're manipulated undermines the idea that they're responsible, but those things were supposed to be enough, right? Like having the right psychology or being reasons responsive. And then we could say, we don't see any principled way to distinguish between determinism, which guarantees from the moment of our birth, beforehand, really, from the first state of the universe, that we're going to be a certain way and do a certain thing. How can we distinguish that from manipulation, where manipulation at the moment of birth, or even right before our action or whatever, guarantees that we're going to do a certain thing a certain way? If we can have these conditions in both cases, right? We can be responsive to reasons and all that. It's kind of hard to draw this distinction, you might think. Therefore, we have to conclude that determinism is basically just like manipulation with respect to responsibility. That is to say, we aren't responsible if determinism is true, just like we wouldn't be responsible if someone manipulated these conditions into us. Right? And then you have these two kinds of replies. You can do one of two things as a compatibilist. You can say, well, I just accept that manipulated agents are responsible. I just accept it. Right? They have the conditions. What else do you want? Or you can have a soft line reply where you say, well, there's a difference between determinism and manipulation. That's a difference that's relevant to responsibility. Obviously, there are differences. You might wear a red shirt and a blue shirt, and that's different, but that doesn't matter to responsibility. So we need a responsibility-relevant difference, right? But there's a worry that whatever difference that is, it can just be worked back in. So for example, you might say, well, the difference is determinism is not an agent. That's just like the way the laws of nature might be. But manipulation is an agent, and then we could shift the responsibility back to the agent, but not to deterministic laws. Like, okay, well, imagine a lightning bolt hit. Remember from the zygote case. Hit the zygote in just such a way that it made it so it would grow up into blah, 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 and do this thing. Seems like it shouldn't really have any. Why does it matter that it's a goddess that knows the laws of nature versus a lightning bolt that just happens to coincide with the laws of nature and to make you grow up and determines you to do a certain thing on a certain day at a certain time? Why does that matter? Right. So it seems like we can work them back in. So there just seems to be a worry here. Now, if history matters, right, if how your capacities, the manipulation argument and this stuff is supposed to be intuitive pushes towards the idea that history matters. That's all. Even if this is successful, the soft line reply is successful, and we do find a difference. We've still shown that history matters. Right? So the question is, if history matters, can we stop the full-blown slip into skepticism? Right? So they have two options, right? Compatibilists can identify some relevant difference. That's the soft line reply. Some historical feature that needs to be there, or that maybe needs to not be there in order to be responsible. And there's a risk here of being ad hoc. You don't want to just say, here's my conditions for what it takes to be a moral agent, plus you can't be manipulated. It's just like, this is not a very sophisticated way of saying it, but it's just not fair. It's not fair to say that, because all you're doing is saying, oh, my view of what it takes to be a moral agent can't really handle manipulation cases, so I'll just add to the view that you can't be manipulated. All right? You need to say more than that. So you can also try to identify some non-historical feature that's relevant and say like, well, I don't really care about the history leading up to the cause or to the action, but when at the moment, non-historical, right? At the moment of action, or at the moment your action is caused, you need to be in this way or that way. And some people, so for instance, you might think, well, you need to be healthy. Like your action needs to be caused by a healthy mechanism. And you might think, well, a manipulated mechanism is not a healthy mechanism. It's not like your mechanism engaging by proper functioning. There's worries how that might end up not working because it seems like health is going to be a historical concept itself. So there's just questions here about how to do that, right? But those are the two options if history matters. But the main worry, it just seems like our actions resulting from factors beyond our control is really kind of the worry here. Whether determinism is true, whether indeterminism is true, this just kind of gets us back to Peerboom. What seems to matter is whether we've acted from factors beyond our control, whether our action results from factors that are beyond our control, whether that's the beginning of the universe being determined, or whether that's acting now in an undetermined world where we have different available options, but nothing about us really making the difference, right? The factors that make the difference to how we act are kind of outside of us. And this is Peerboom's disappearing agent objection. Which he thinks agent causal libertarian might solve, but there's questions about that. But the point here is that maybe no one's ever really the proper source of our actions. That's the worry with history, right? It may not be determinism. It may just be the fact that we never act from, that we're never the proper source of our action, right? That's just the question. And then you think about the basic argument, the consequence argument, and what were the replies to those arguments. That's kind of the debate there. But then you have this other debate where this is just Wallace kind of considering other questions that are coming up related to history. If history matters, the compatibilist has a couple options that they need to try to figure out. If history does matter, we might have to worry about skepticism being the proper source of our actions. If skepticism ends up being true, is all hope lost? Now, Strawson and the followers obviously say, yes, all hope is lost, because they say, well, it's necessary for our humanity, right? Strawson, Wolf, even Smolansky thinks this. Skepticism is bad. He thinks skepticism is true, but it's bad. That's why he thinks illusionism is the right way to go. But others are more hopeful, right? Might have replacement systems for different ways to do different ways to do a moral responsibility system, kind of a system of blame and punishment, holding people accountable. We just do that differently if no one is really genuinely responsible, right? And Peerboom thinks even some of our reactive attitudes can remain, right? So Peerboom, Greg Caruso, who's kind of like a follower of Peerboom, kind of helps to fill in his account in places, and he does a lot of practical philosophy work. So he takes the kind of Peerboom model. He has his own book and papers, and he's written with Peerboom where he defends this kind of model as well. The skeptic model, and then the sort of same type of replacement system, this incapacitation system. But then Caruso does a lot more practical stuff. Peerboom does practical stuff too, but Caruso is very much into like the justice system and how we should reform that and everything. So the point is, anyways, others have more hope for not losing all hope if skepticism is true. And even Wallace, who's a compatibilist, thinks that skepticism would not necessarily undermine our responsibility system. Okay. Now, could Strawsonian moral responsibility itself imply some kind of pessimism? This is where Wallace ends us. He says, look, perhaps it's revisionary. If Strawson is right, that might be revisionary, right? It's just not the way, like thinking of responsibility in this way is just not the way that we think about free will and responsibility. We think about the ability to do otherwise. We think about these powers sometimes. At least Sometimes we think this way. So that might be a way in which it's pessimistic because we lose this concern for this ultimate up to usness, right? It's also subject to empirical work, right? So maybe some experimental philosophy, whether or not this is revisionary, how people in fact think about responsibility, and whether it entails this idea of ultimate control. But also, Strawsonian responsibility, right, might be sort of negative or have this pessimistic implication because maybe we can't and maybe we shouldn't ignore these sourcehood worries about things being up to us, having ultimate control. And there's this kind of critical compatibilism that Russell talks about. He says they criticize Strawsonian views, other compatibilist views, when they try to ignore this up to usness, having ultimate control, right? And Russell's response here is, yeah, okay, maybe Strawsonian responsibility is pessimistic in this way, but the pessimism is the idea that we are responsible even though we lack ultimate control. That's what might be pessimistic. So just this idea of he wants to consider at the end of whether there's a kind of pessimism in Strawsonian responsibility. Kind of interesting. All right, let's do some takeaway. So Strawson really, really changed the way people thought about responsibility and free will. Okay, he naturalized it. He wanted to insulate it from obscure and panicky metaphysics, is what he called it. These ideas of thinking about the ultimate history of the world, the laws of nature. He's like, this is just crazy. We don't need to think about this stuff. We have very natural practices that we can ground our justification of holding people responsibility in those practices themselves. Right? Reactive attitudes, being responsible should be understood in terms of when it's appropriate to hold someone responsible. Right? He really changed the way a lot of people thought about this stuff. And he opened up a pathway for people to change their thinking about this stuff, which they did. All right, so check out Russell's critique of Strawson, right? The critique of these three arguments, and especially this emphasis on moral capacity, or this lack of emphasis, I should say, on moral capacity in the Strawsonian picture. And then Wallace comes in and tries to add to that with reflective self-control. Self-reflective control. Whoops. Sorry. Reflective self-control. And the role for the sentiment. So Wallace had this sentiment-based Strawsonian sense of when it's appropriate to hold someone responsible, and then this Kantian idea of moral agency is basically reasoned responsiveness. It's about grasping and applying moral reasons. And then Smith and Russell kind of give this critique of the order of reversal. So pay attention to that as well. And then we just ask these other kind of related questions that have been coming up. Is history important? Does that lead to skepticism? Is skepticism a bad thing if we end up there? Right? Manipulation cases are just important. They're important to think about. They're just interesting to think about. Right? Does history matter? Manipulation cases suggest that they do. And then that determinism matters. And then you have these two replies, but then you just might ask, kind of, as it's interesting, is there a way to stop the slippery slope into skepticism? Once we get sourcehood mattering, can we block skepticism? Right? Because determinism might be a problem for sourcehood. Luck might be a problem for sourcehood if indeterminism is true. So how do we stop those? And this just goes back to the stuff we've been talking about for weeks now. All right. And then if skepticism does result, and we've talked about this before as well, is that bad? Some people say, no, it's not bad, especially Strawsonians. Sorry, it is bad. They would say, yes, skepticism is bad. It's a bleak outlook. It would dehumanize us if we were skeptics. Right? But other, mostly skeptics, argue that it's not so bad. We can save a lot of what we care about. Right? And then Russell just suggests at the end, reconciling Strawsonian moral responsibility with a sort of more acceptable pessimism. He wants to say, well, the pessimism is really that we are responsible. We know we're responsible. This is what the pessimist kind of starts with, right? The pessimist is the libertarian. They're like, look, we are responsible. Determinism is a problem, says the pessimist. Strawson disagrees, but they agree that we should have the starting point that, like, look, we're responsible. We just need to figure out how to work that out. And the pessimism is that, oh, when we work it out, it seems like we're responsible, but we don't have ultimate control. Or at least we don't need to think about that. That might be the pessimism that Russell suggests. All right, well, that's going to do it for Strawsonian moral responsibility. Thanks.